Today on the Andrew Cooperrider show, we'll be digging into how the Kentucky media has helped shape Beshear's image and why that's led to him being ranked as one of the most quote-unquote beloved governors in the country, when actually he doesn't really do much, leaves him free to kind of wiggle around an awful lot. MSNBC had on a group of female voters that had priorly voted for Trump, asking what they thought of Kamala Harris. It went just as bad as you'd expect it would. You've probably seen this video by now, but the reactions to their reactions tells us exactly what they're planning on doing to try to shame the rest of the country into voting for quite an awful president Kamala Harris would end up being. We see some recent examples here in Kentucky of how the establishment Republicans, who so often call the more conservative types the rhinos, the not Republicans, the not real people, we'll show you the most recent example of just how we know that, well, these people are full of it. They're the ones who are willing to support Democrats. We see that right here in Kentucky. And then finally, those of you who've been watching the show on a regular basis, and if you haven't, if you've just been seeing it weekly, I remind you this show isn't just available in a video format on TV or on social media. It's not just available there on the radio. It's also available in a podcast format, and you can listen each and every day, Monday through Friday, by visiting theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's theandrewshow.com and hitting the Listen Now tab. But those of you who have been listening know that I've been digging into some of the state house level races. And today we're going to have on a candidate from Kentucky's 41st district, a heavy Democrat district. We're going to have on a Republican candidate in it, though, and ask her why she's running in the race, what she hopes to accomplish, what are her chances, and how does she think she's going to win. We're going to have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Of course, if you want to reach out to the show, feel free to email info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. So as I mentioned, a new poll has come out ranking Beshear as the second most liked governor in the country, highest Democrat governor in the country. This is what's earning him to get that second look from Kamala Harris at the national level for vice president. You may be saying, Andrew, this is a pretty Republican state. Why does Beshear why does he enjoy such high approval ratings? And in large part, it has to do with the fact that Beshear is able to say all the warm, fuzzy things and promise you the moon to make you feel good, then blame it on the Republicans when he can't deliver the moon, but then also get to take credit for the accomplishments of those who are having to tell him no. And we see this most recent example as Beshear has touted that he has once again somehow managed to pull off 4 years in a row of budget surplus, in this case, almost $1 billion in budget surplus. And the media runs with it. They run these headlines talking about how Beshear's very accomplished. They might mention down low about, how Republicans kind of sort of maybe run the budget, and Beshear doesn't deserve to take any kind of credit for it at all. But that's maybe that they end up doing that. No, instead, they'll just go ahead and run the headlines that Beshear announces that he's got a $1 billion surplus. But if we actually bothered to look at it, something that I've never seen the media do, when Beshear is taking, credit for economic budget type things that are run solely by the legislature, economic decisions like that are being decided solely by the legislature, Beshear can't do it on his own. He can't negotiate necessarily those deals with the legislature on how much money to spend it on what. They kind of make it without him. In fact, one year they made the budget before he even got out a suggestion. Now, it's true that on the economic development side of things, Beshear largely gets to steer that, largely gets to make the deals, though they do have to be approved by the legislature. So when some of these deals end up going belly up, as I believe they will, that will get hung around his neck like a stone. But don't forget to blame the Republicans in the legislature for it as well, of course, because they are just as guilty. But the media has never once looked at the numbers and said, okay, when Beshear's claiming he has this big budget surplus, what would that surplus be if they went with Beshear's budget? So I bothered to take a look, and I want to give you an example of just what I mean. When we take a look at, let's just take the transportation budget for the 24-25 and 25-26 fiscal years. This was the most recently made budget by the legislature, and Bashir made a suggested budget and had it filed as its own budget bill. That was his suggestion, and then he also, we can compare that to what the Republicans actually put forward. And we look at Bashir's transportation budget. Bashir has a transportation budget in the first year, because remember, they budget 2 years at a time, and he has the first year as $3,869,173,100. That's his first year. Then when we look at his second year budgeting, he has budgeted $3,755,126,700. That's just in transportation. Now, when we look at the Republican budget, the budget that was actually passed for these same items, what do we see? We see that the Republicans passed a transportation budget that has the first year at just $3,532,762,700. That is over $300 million less than Bashir's suggested budget. And then on the second year, they have $3,623,382 and $382,600. That is a full about $130 million less than Bashir. So just over those two alone, we see $480 million, almost $500 million in difference between what Bashir wanted to spend and what the Republicans actually ended up spending. And so when Bashir sits there and celebrates things like having this $1 billion surplus, it certainly leaves you okay to ask some questions like, is that really something Bashir can take credit for? Is that something that Bashir needs to kind of back away from? In fact, if he was in control, would that have happened? Well, it appears not. Most of the time, Bashir wants to spend that money like it's burning a hole in his pocket. But what's really troubling is the fact that the media won't call him on that. It took me all of 20 to 30 minutes of Googling and research in order to find Bashir's suggested transportation budget and then to compare that to the transportation budget that was actually passed. They could simply do this same research. They see Bashir put out a headline saying that he's got $1 billion surplus, and then they don't bother to go and look at the numbers, compare the budgets, and see if Bashir had his way, would that surplus really have existed? Why? Because they're bought in. They don't want to do that work. They want to see Bashir being pushed forward just as much as a normal Democrat does, because most of them are extremely liberal themselves. In fact, you can't find a conservative amongst the Kentucky mainstream media. And then they wonder why papers like Courier-Journal and Herald Leader are dying. They wonder why listenership, readership, that would be newspapers. They wonder why readership is going down the tubes. It's because you're not putting out information that is even slightly even-handed. You're acting as a mouthpiece for the governor. It becomes even more obvious as we're coming into this Veep stakes for Kamala Harris, because we've seen the Kentucky media shilling for them heavily. And I've told you before, if you listen to the show on a regular basis, that there's a specific reason why they're doing this. If Bashir gets chosen as the vice president, it could be pretty big for them. They could get called up to the big leagues. After all, places like Courier-Journal are a part of the USA Today network. And so they could end up covering Bashir in D.C. if he ends up becoming the vice president. They will shill for it hard. And when they're called out for shilling for it, well, they'll pretend like that's not the case. We actually see a few tweets from reporters trying to claim that, no, we don't want him to become vice president. In fact, if Bashir became vice president, I would have to work even more. And I don't want to do that, which, yeah, okay, like you don't want to be writing for the big papers up in D.C. Come on now. Let's not play games. So coming up after this, we'll be taking a look at MSNBC had on a panel of women talking about Kamala Harris. We'll take a look at the social media's response to that. Also, assuming we have time, we'll go ahead and dig into a few of these so-called Republicans around the state and just how they're reacting to their losses. We'll have that after this short break. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Now, obviously with Kamala Harris being the presumptive nominee, we've seen the media ramping up trying to convince everyone to go ahead and vote for her. And they held a little focus group in Wisconsin. This was with a couple of women who were Trump voters They're white. Important for you to know. If you're listening to the audio only, you can't see the video we're about to play. These are all white women. And MSNBC proceeded to ask them some questions about Kamala Harris. And we're shocked that it turned out exactly how you would expect it to turn out. Let me give you just a few minutes of this right here.
How do you perceive Vice President Harris compared to President Biden in terms of competency and experience?
I think she's worse. She doesn't even know what's going on at the border.
Right.
And that's what she was
supposed to be doing
and in charge of. I mean, as a school teacher, if I did not do what I was supposed to be doing, you better believe my job would be in jeopardy. Well, it isn't. It not only was her job not in jeopardy, she was just handed a promotion.
Is there anyone that Kamala Harris could appoint as her vice president that you would find reassuring, would make you consider voting for her?
No. Never consider voting for her. No. I would do RFK Jr. way before her.
Now, what did they expect here? Right? Did they expect a bunch of Trump voters to suddenly fall in love with the Democrat policies because it's a woman now representing them versus a man? I mean, they tried this already back in, 2016, Trump versus a woman. Didn't work out for him well there. I guess they were hoping if they combined the Hillary Clinton and Obama together and used instead a black woman, it would suddenly turn out differently. However, it's not going that way. But this won't stop the Democrats from trying to shame people for just saying how they think. It's very reasonable for somebody to take a look at Kamala Harris, look at her, what she hasn't really done, look at her laugh, look at her behavior, look at the way the media has talked about her, not just on the right, but on the left, and say, look, I want nothing to do with her. This is now the eighth look at Kamala Harris they're trying to do. I know she's enjoying a wave right now because she's newly announced and the media is really hopeful and the media has to push her. She has got to win. They need her to do better than Joe Biden would have. Because remember, it was the media who basically pushed Joe Biden out. And so if the media pushed out Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris didn't come in and do really well, they would lose a lot of their leftist base. People on CNN and MSNBC and all these places that really were part of saying, oh my goodness, we suddenly realized that Joe Biden is just not there completely mentally. He needs to go. Well, but if they pushed him, and then they didn't end up getting somebody better or somebody doesn't win or perform well, they will be blamed by their listening base for telling them Joe Biden needed to go. So they need Kamala Harris to win more than Kamala Harris needs Kamala Harris to win. And so you're going to see this weird, perverse media cycle going on. And they will buy into the same exact narratives that we're already seeing online. I wanted to read to you somebody's take on that particular video here. This is from an Ely Mistel on Twitter. This has 1 million people have seen this tweet. Okay, this isn't a small tweet, and it has over 20,000 likes. So a lot of people seem to agree with this statement. Let's read what she has to say here. Just to unpack a bit of the racism here, the lady who says she thinks Harris is not smart is also the lady who said she doesn't know anything about her or what she did as vice president. So with no actual knowledge, she just assumes the black woman is not smart. Now, this woman here is not assuming Kamala Harris is not smart because she's black. She's assuming Kamala Harris is not smart because she says things like this.
So Ukraine is a country in Europe. It exists next to another country called Russia.
We campaign with the plan. Uppercase T, uppercase P. The plan.
Do you plan to visit the border?
Not today. But I have before, and I'm sure I will again. I've said I'm going to go to the border. And
when are you going to the border, Vice President?
The administration has asked. I'm not finished. We've been to the border. So this whole thing about the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And mean, I don't understand the point that you're making.
I'm being clear with you right now.
Yes, okay.
And so if you're interested, I'll continue to be clear. There are a whole lot of people, especially people who live in rural communities, who don't, there's no Kinko's, there's no Office Max near them. It is time for us to do what we have been doing, and that time is every day. We are doing it.
But should we have done it sooner?
We are doing it.
What do you see as the biggest national security challenge confronting the U.S.? What is the thing that worries you and keeps you up at night?
Frankly, one of them is our democracy.
You don't feel misused or underused?
No, I don't.
When folks vote, they order what they want, and in this case, they got what they asked for. I went off script a little bit.
So equity as a concept says, recognize that everyone has the same capacity, but in order for them to have equal opportunity to reach that capacity, we must pay attention to this issue of equity if we are to expect and allow people to compete on equal footing.
I'm going to share with you a very simple story, which is that I went home one day and I said, well, why are conservatives bad, Mommy? Because I thought we were supposed to conserve things. I couldn't reconcile it. Now I can.
If I heard those things, I also wouldn't think somebody's smart. I don't need to know anything else about you. If you looked at me and said, what'd you do, fall from a coconut tree? And you cackled like that? Yeah, I would be like, wow, this person is not that intelligent. If you talked to me and talked in this word salad way that Kamala Harris does, I'd say, oh, this person is a self-important pontificator who has nothing of importance to say. That's why they have to buy time with words that, while they can, in theory, go together, are devoid of any actual meaning or purpose. They don't mean anything. Nothing at all. Because they have no cognizant linear thought. She's just saying a word salad. That tells me you're not that intelligent at all. So yeah, it's perfectly normal that people would respond that way. I want to take a look at another story here, returning back here to Kentucky, and we are going to have an interview with the Republican candidate in the 41st House District here in Kentucky coming up after this. And so on that subject of state house here in Kentucky, there was an interesting feud, a war that was going on the Republican primary between the conservative Republicans and the establishment Republicans. And one of those people on the conservative side was Marion Proctor. She was a conservative Republican. She's been in office now for 2 years, majorly pushed on things like certificate of need repealing. She's been on the show many times. Anybody who's watched the show for any length of time knows exactly who Marion Proctor is. And so she was one of the people that the establishment attempted to take out. Why? Because she has the audacity to propose things like certificate of need laws that would repeal the monopoly that healthcare has in Kentucky. And those with the money, those who earn money off government, those with the big bucks in the medical care field, well, they couldn't stand for that. So they had to push against her. And so they spent a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, on her opponent, who failed miserably. She won in a landslide. And now we're moving on to the general election. And we start to see Republicans supporting her Democrat opponent, or the family of Republicans. For an example, take a look at this fundraiser. You may see a few names on there. You know, you'll see Amy McGrath, big name, of course. She's a fighter pilot, in case you didn't know that. She's a fighter pilot. You'll see some other names, but one of the ones I want you to zoom in on here is Christy Poore, Poore Nelson, as well as Liz Poore. That's another one. Now, do you think they're of some relation to supposed Republican Kimberly Poore, same spelling, Mosier? Of course they are. That's Kimberly Mosier's family. And what's hilarious is during Kim Mosier's election, there were so many people talking about how she's the true Republican in the race, when actually Kim Mosier is nothing more than a lapdog for the Kentucky Medical Association, something, by the way, her husband is deeply involved in. Her husband's a doctor as well. So, of course, they're in debt to that medical entire apparatus there. They will do their bidding. She will insist she's the real Republican. Even though we see that through her family lashing out at, the conservatives out there because you don't like the fact that they actually stand for something. They stand for the base of the party. You don't like that. And we know that's true because while Kim Mosier also had an opponent, you see, Marion Proctor had an opponent that had hundreds of thousands of dollars and lost in a landslide. Kim Mosier had hundreds of thousands of dollars, went up against somebody who had like 30 grand to spend on a campaign between her own campaign and a few others. And they came within 50 votes. So let me ask you, who do you think better represents the Republicans? The person who doesn't need to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and wins in a landslide against big money, or the person who needs big money to win by 50 seats against an underfunded conservative opponent? Who's a real Republican there? Well, as I said, speaking of state house races, when we come back, we'll be sitting down with Sarah Elizabeth Cantrell, who is the Republican candidate for House District 41 in Louisville. Stay with us. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Those of you who've been listening to the show for some time know that I've been covering some House races going on this November. There's more than just the presidential race at the top of the ticket. Of course, it's those local elections. And I cover them because I do think they truthfully matter. Because even when you take a look at people like Kamala Harris, the presumptive nominee here for president on the Democrat side of things, her first office was a local prosecutor's office. Joe Biden's first office was on county council, the equivalent of a county magistrate here in Kentucky. Obama was a state House rep first, and the list goes on and on and on. And so those local elections might be where you're voting on who will be possibly a president at some point down the line. So taking time to pay close attention to those, I find extremely important. Now, those of you who've listened to the show as I've been working through races have heard me mention a few times about why do people sometimes run in races where they don't seem to have some chance. When you look at the past and you see it's a 70-30 kind of split one way or the other, why do people go about that? What's the process going through them? And so she offered to come on and talk to us about her race. So I want to thank you for joining us, Sarah Elizabeth Cottrell. Did I say that right?
Cottrell. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sarah Elizabeth Cottrell for joining us, running in House District 41. That's in Louisville, currently an open seat. Thank you for joining us, Sarah Elizabeth.
Yeah, good to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So first, let's start off and talk about the district. What does that district look like? What area of Louisville does it cover? How's that registration? And what are kind of the politics of that district?
Sure. It is essentially, the quickest way to say it is it's the Highlands, but it starts in Hikes Point and then runs through the Highlands, including like Sullivan University and up through the zoo area. A lot of the Highlands, including parts of Cherokee Park, over to past the zoo to Audubon Hospital and St. X. So the Tyler Park, that's the kind of area that it is. It is an area that is Democrat to Republican ratio, approximately 5-1. So yeah. It is
actually funny enough, I used to live in that district.
Oh, really?
So when I was a younger man, I got a job in Louisville, so I moved from Lexington to Louisville. I didn't have very much money. This is going down a rabbit hole. But I didn't have very much money, and so I went ahead and I found a roommate off Craigslist, and it was in the Highlands, and I was paying like $300 a month for a room that didn't even have a door. I was there for a few weeks until one evening I woke up hearing my roommate / landlord arguing with another friend over who took his heroin. And at that point, I packed up and I left, and I ended up homeless for about 3 months, sleeping in my car while I was working in Louisville because I didn't have the money to get another place. So Highlands for me, my experience was leaving me homeless or living with drug addicts. Those were my two choices as a young man. So a little funny story, I guess you could say, a little bit of background.
Yeah, so there's some density of population there in some apartment complexes. Like I did 1400 Willow is like the real tall one in Cherokee Park, and then some apartments over like in Breckenridge. But a lot of it is turn of the century homes, Victorian homes.
Yeah, that's what I was living in.
One of the highest concentrations.
That's what I was living in, some sort of like 3-storied old home with an apartment on each level. That was kind of how it was set up.
It sounds like several of the streets I'm very familiar with. So it's one of the districts with the highest concentration of families or people making over $100,000 a year. So it's a fairly wealthy district. Also one of the least diverse districts in Louisville, and one of the most childless districts in Louisville. So it's a lot.
I can see why it'd be an uphill battle for a conservative. Why are you putting yourself through running in that race if it is such an uphill battle and so difficult?
Yeah, the easiest answer is that I got into it so that people would have someone to vote for, people like me. I moved up here from Okolona in 2020, and it was a very different, it's almost like changing states or countries. Like it's just very, very different culture, moving from Okolona, the southern part of Louisville, up into this area. And I went to vote in 2020, and essentially below like the president and Senate, there was nobody to vote for me, because I vote pro-life and I vote conservative, and there were no conservatives on the ballot. And so I ended up leaving several of the offices blank and was just incredibly frustrated. Like, what is this, Cuba, where you like check yes or no on Castro and there's no one else to vote for? And of course, the political situation in 2020 had us all maybe a little bit more interested in politics than we would have been if we weren't before. And so I thought, well, it's only $200 to file for the office. And so I can put my name on the ballot just to be there so that somebody will have somebody to vote for. And then, so that's what I decided to do in 22. And I don't know that there ever was a Republican primary. The current representative was the woman I am running against now, Mary Lou Marzian. And she had represented this area since I was in the 9th grade. So 14 landslide elections. And the more I found out about her, the more I cared about the race. So when I got into it, I was just going to be a name for people to check. But the more I learned about her, the more passionate I became about exposing her to the people she is not representing. And so they redrew the districts in that year, and there wasn't supposed to be a primary for Republicans. The three of us, I live right in the heart of the district. The other two live on the very edges of the district in opposite directions. And so we ended up in this weird primary. I lost the primary. But then Marzian ended up with another incumbent in the same race. And so that was Josie Raymond. Marzian said she would retire and let Raymond take the seat. And so Raymond won in another landslide election in fall of 22. Well, then Josie Raymond was another powerless Democrat in the state house, but even more vocally angry and name calling and insulting people. And so she got nothing accomplished for this district.
I've covered her a few times on the show. She is very... she's clearly there for the likes, the clicks. We see that a lot, especially in people find themselves in bodies where they can't get anything done politically. They start to really care more about just how do I get the hits on the TV? How do I create, the things I can turn around to my voters and say, look at me. How do I say the things that gets me the most attention from the very liberal media we have in Kentucky? We do see that a fair amount, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And so Josie got frustrated with the lack of progress that she was able to make. And so she decided to go to Louisville Metro Council. She's unopposed. She's going to take that seat in November. But then she and Marzian are cut a little bit from the same cloth, except that Marzian's activism legislating is also paired with just laziness. Because after 14 landslide elections, why would you bother? And so her last 3 sessions, she did not vote on almost half the bills that came up for a vote. The maps that redrew her into the district with Raymond, which she and all the Louisville women went on television blasting that the men in Frankfort were passing these misogynistic, sadistic maps to get them out of the legislature. She didn't even vote on those maps. She wasn't there that day. And so that's the passion that I'm trying to take, that I know I'm going to lose. But if I can help the people of this district understand that they're not being represented, and maybe it will inspire her to actually show up and vote, which is her actual job.
Makes sense. We're going to talk a little bit about what could be a winning strategy in Louisville, because this is a debate actually that ranges in Lexington and Louisville and some of these other districts where they find a little bit liberal of an areas. How do Republicans, how do conservatives win, even on local races? We'll talk about that, but we are coming up on a break. We'll be back in a few short minutes. And we are back in this final segment of the Andrew Cooperrider Show. I am joined by Sarah Elizabeth, running in the 41st District there in Louisville. Sarah Elizabeth Cottrell. So before the break, we were kind of talking about what's going on in the district. Why did you decide to run? And it just kind of sounds like you're saying, the number one reason why is to, one, provide an option for people like yourself. And then two, because you have individuals that are kind of just easing their way through it. They're kind of lazy when they get to it. They're not very responsive to the people. And so by at least having a challenge, you're hoping that they're a little bit more responsive to the voters. In this case, the person you're running against, you'd said she didn't even show up for half the votes this past year because she just doesn't care.
Well, in the session, in her last session,
in her last session,
the last couple of years, yeah.
Sure, absolutely. And so, but when it comes to the race, obviously, I'm sure, while that is maybe a good outcome for you, I'm sure the best outcome would be winning. When you look at a district like the 41st District, or you look at some of these situations, in Lexington, we've got the school board races, Jefferson County school board races, judge races, city council races, and you just see a lot of these liberals in the area winning. You'd like to see Republicans be able to win there, especially as they've been able to win in so many other places around the state as far as with the state house and the state senate goes. And hopefully we can win the governor here in a few years. So once we have all Republicans there and we have these super duper majorities outside of primary work in those races, really it comes down to how can we improve upon especially these liberal holds of Louisville and Lexington. And so that way, too, it doesn't bleed into the other areas because their problems seem to bleed all around. So in your opinion, how do we win? How do Republicans win in Louisville?
Well, people vote their interests and their values, or they should. People should vote their interests and their values, but they don't always, right? They vote their party. And the message that needs to happen in Louisville is that your party is not representing your interests and your values. Now, there are some who legitimately are. So Lisa Wilner is a dedicated representative for her district. Daniel Grossberg, disagree with him on any number of things. He had a 100% voting record. He responded to his constituents. So those races are tougher because their representatives are working hard and actually doing something that reflects the demographics of their district. But when you have an opponent like Mary Lou Marzian in my district, people are voting on things like, let's say the LGBTQ agenda or abortion. They want to hammer this because Bashir started it, right, about the exceptions for rape and incest, and then the whole drag queen thing about you are so anti-LGBTQ. That's the thing that Marzian's going to hammer, that she's going to represent your interests in Frankfort. And my message to the constituents of District 41 is that neither of the women who are on this ballot are going to further those causes for you. Neither, because Marzian cannot even testify in committee. So she actually had a Democrat primary with a young, energetic lawyer and in the debate with him, she admitted that she cannot get anything done in Frankfort unless the Republican majority already wants it, and she keeps her fingerprints off of it. She said, they won't let Democrats have bills. I'll keep my fingerprints off of it. Well, it's not true that they don't let Democrats have bills. There were several Democrats who got bills passed this session.
Yeah, I believe out of Louisville, Senator, younger guy. He's a senator out of Louisville. He had,
sure.
Yeah, he had a bill to deal with like porch pirates.
Yep.
That
was year before last, and then this year there were 6 or 7 that the Democrats got passed or co-sponsoring. I saw Rachel Rourke, who is a brand new, very young representative. She's the one running against Carrie Sanders McKeon. I saw her testify again in committee this session, and Mary Lou Marzian can't. So I think that's the target, is like, is the opponent actually representing their district? As far as are they representing your values? Can they do anything? Can they do anything for you? And if not, why would you vote on, just the LGBTQ issue or just the abortion issue when they can't accomplish anything on that? But the problem is that they also can't accomplish anything on anything else. And so why not vote for someone who can? Because I am not sitting on the culture war in this district. That's another thing in Louisville. There are several of us. Ken Fleming doesn't sit there. Jason Nemeth doesn't park there a lot. And I'm an unapologetic evangelical Christian, and I hold all those positions on the culture war. I go to the Bible for my beliefs, and so I am not apologetic about that. But in this race, I just want people to know that neither one of us are going to forward those particular issues. But I have very legitimate policy points on education that have to do with certifying more people as teachers and helping kids face less testing. And I want to see nuclear energy transform Kentucky. In her debate, they asked her about nuclear energy. Rick Adams, her opponent, was for it, the primary opponent. She said she was against it because, I quote, Paducah is on the San Andreas Fault, the one in California. So Joe Girth was there, like the news was there hosting this debate. Can you imagine if a Republican had said that Western Kentucky was on the San Andreas Fault? Like how many?
Oh, yeah.
Who would have carried that the next day? Nobody said a word except me. And so that's what I see as my mission, is to say, don't check it just because it's a D. So I'm actually going to do an ad campaign if I raise the funds for it. Speaking of which, I have a fundraiser coming up this Tuesday at 8020 Kalen's, which is one of the best eateries in District 41 at 6 o'clock. So I'll put in a plug for that. But if I raise the funds, one of my ad messages is going to be that you don't just like leave it blank. You can't vote for me because we don't agree on abortion or whatever. Fine. Just leave it blank, because every check mark by her name is essentially an approval message to say, go back and do the same thing, which is don't show up, don't vote, misrepresent us. And her other pet thing, which is satire legislation, things like, her most famous one was that men would have to get written permission from their wives if they needed a Viagra prescription, and swear on a Bible that they would only use it in marriage. She had one to distribute handguns to newborns in the hospital. She asked for legislation dissolving every small city in Jefferson County. Like this, so it's either she doesn't show up or she wants satire shock legislation. And I'm an alternative. So I think to answer your question briefly would be, paint yourself as the person who's actually going to move the interests of your district forward. You have to know your district and not pretend that people in other parts of Kentucky are affecting this particular race.
Yeah, and one of the things that I talk about on the show often to conservatives is that it's not enough to just go out and vote for conservative people. We have to actually convince people over to the conservative message, and asking a politician, especially one that's in a down ballot race, to go out there and be the vehicle for getting your policy done convincing the populace in a district to those ideas. Take for an example, the abortion argument and that conversation. And my hit on pro-life activist groups often is you've run off to the legislators and you dabble in the Republican primaries, but you're not doing anything. You're not doing any door-knocking campaigns, ad campaigns to the actual people, to the voters, to argue about why life begins at conception, and to get that message out there to individuals. And so, obviously, I think that kind of pushing on those issues would go a long way, where you don't have to just say, hey, she can't do anything for you either, but rather the constituents actually kind of force her to move on an issue or don't vote for her because they actually disagree with her policy standpoints. And I know that's a long-term work, but unfortunately, for all the money that the Louisville Republican Party seems to have, I don't typically see them dumping money into that kind of work too often. As far as it goes, I don't know exactly what they spend everything on. I'd have to go look at their KREF report. Well, Sarah Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. Remind everybody, check out Sarah Elizabeth's fundraiser.
Tuesday, the 30th of July, 6 to 8 p.m. at 8020 Kalen's, a historic eatery in District 41. That's on Newburgh Road across from St. Agnes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us. To all of you, we'll see you back here tomorrow.